Thomas Cranmer, Oxford, March 21st, 1556. He burned himself. Not by accident, not in madness. He did it with purpose. He stretched out his right hand, thin, pale, shaking into the hungry fire, and held it there, skin blistered, muscle curled. The stench of burning flesh swallowed the morning air. He screamed, not from pain, but from guilt. "This hand hath offended," he said again. And again. His body convulsed. His robes caught. Flames licked his face, but he didn't pull back. He wanted to burn. He needed to burn. They said he was a coward, a traitor, that he recanted his faith to save his skin. But what if that was only half the truth? The guards looked away. A woman in the crowd fainted. One priest began to weep, not for his soul, but for what he had just undone. Because this death was not an execution. It was a reversal, a betrayal turned inside out. He had written 6 recantations, each one more humiliating than the last. He begged the Pope for forgiveness. He cursed his own theology. He spat on everything he built. And yet, in the final moment, when the script was written and the flames were lit, he refused to play his part. What changed? What did he know? And why did he choose to die screaming? While holding his own hand in the fire like an offering to something far older than Rome. They tried to erase that moment, to bury it beneath church law and royal silence. But the bones of that fire still whisper. And now, we're going to listen. The winter mist lay thick over Nottinghamshire, curling like old smoke between the hedgerows. When Thomas Cranmer first walked the muddy path toward Cambridge, he was 19. Thin, quiet, with ink-stained fingers and eyes that rarely met your gaze. Books were his refuge. Latin, Greek, the early fathers of the church. He spoke softly, listened intently, even then. Something in him clung to certainty, not loud, not proud, but deep. A certainty that truth was something you could touch if you looked long enough in the dark. But Cambridge in the early 1500s was not safe ground. Not for thinkers, not anymore. The air in the cloisters had turned volatile. Whispers of Luther crept in through foreign manuscripts, smuggled from the continent, ideas about faith without the Pope, grace without penance, a God who didn't answer to Rome. Cranmer heard it, saw it, and rejected it. He was still Catholic then, firmly. He scoffed at Luther's defiance, called it arrogant, heretical, dangerous. He argued theology like a craftsman sharpening a blade precise, deliberate, never rushed. And yet, somewhere deep inside, something cracked. It wasn't a bolt of lightning, no vision, no great rebellion, just questions, quiet ones. What if salvation didn't come through the church alone? What if ceremony was shadow, not substance? He never said these things aloud, not yet. But they lived in his breath. Then came the plague. It swept through Cambridge like a silent scythe. Rooms emptied overnight. Pews went cold. One of Cranmer's closest friends collapsed in chapel and died before sunset. The smell of death soaked the stones. The university shut its gates. Cranmer fled to the countryside. The fields were quieter there, safer, and it was in those quiet fields that his life changed. A royal envoy arrived one evening, coat damp with rain, horse bleeding from the hooves. The king had heard of Cranmer, not his sermons, not his faith, but his mind. The envoy carried one question from Henry VIII himself. Is there scriptural reason to annul a marriage that Rome refuses to break? Cranmer, startled, answered with a theory he had long kept buried in his notes. Marriage, he said, was sacred but conditional. If it violated God's law, it could be undone, even without the Pope. He did not mean to spark a revolution, but that single answer lit a fuse. The king summoned him, not to court yet, but to watch, to listen. Cranmer was dispatched to Europe, to gather opinions, to feel the pulse of Reformation beating through cities like Nuremberg and Zurich. There, in candlelit inns and crowded churches, he saw something he'd never known in England: men preaching without fear, without Latin, without permission, the scriptures open, not guarded, the people singing in their own tongues. Something in him broke loose. He married in secret, a Lutheran woman, defying his own vows of celibacy. He read with fury, wrote with hunger. He began to believe. When Henry named him Archbishop of Canterbury in 1533, it was a shock to everyone, Cranmer included. He stood in Westminster, anointed with oil, draped in vestments that now felt foreign. And yet, when asked to bless the king's new marriage to Anne Boleyn, he did not flinch. He declared the previous marriage void, declared the Pope's authority broken, declared England a sovereign church beneath no crown but its own. The break was bloody. Monasteries dissolved, priests fled, icons burned. But Cranmer remained quiet in his revolution. No speeches, no grand defiance. Instead, he wrote the Book of Common Prayer, not just a collection of liturgies, but a manifesto hidden in plain sight. He stripped the Latin, simplified the sacraments, refused the idea of a mystical transformation in the Eucharist. Bread remained bread. Wine remained wine. God was not in the ritual. God was in the Word. People were furious. Some wept. Others rioted. And yet, the book spread. It was read at weddings, whispered at deathbeds, smuggled into prisons. It changed how England spoke to God. But it also painted a target on Cranmer's back. Even Henry, whose authority Cranmer had once defended, began to pull away. The king wanted obedience, not reformation. And when Anne Boleyn fell, Cranmer was left holding the marriage he had blessed like a curse in his hands. He begged for her life. It was the only time he ever wept in court. She died anyway. And he stayed, because Cranmer believed in continuity, in the slow turning of history's wheel. But he did not see how fast it was spinning now. Edward VI would rise. Mary would come. The fire was already smoldering. But for now, in the flicker of a candle in Lambeth Palace, Thomas Cranmer kept writing. The words came slowly, but each one carried heat. The ink dried slowly on the first edition, the Book of Common Prayer. 1549, not bound in gold, not blessed in Rome, but plain. English. Cranmer held the pages in his hands like something stolen from heaven. He had written it with trembling precision, each phrase crafted to strip away the ritual, the incantation, the Latin veil. No more muttered Latin at the altar. No more whispered Latin at the grave. Now, even the poorest farmer could bury his child in words he understood. Earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. Simple, ruthless, beautiful. But it was not peace that followed. It was chaos. In Devon, peasants revolted. They marched with rosaries in hand, chanting for the old Mass, demanding the return of Latin in churches across England. The old priests cried at the altar. Statues were smashed, walls whitewashed, sacred relics tossed into ditches like bones. To Cranmer, it was birth pangs, necessary, painful, holy. But he didn't walk those roads, didn't see the blood on church steps. He stayed behind cathedral walls, his hands ink-stained, his eyes sunken from long nights of revision. And he kept writing. In 1552, a second version appeared, sharper, cleaner, bolder. He denied transubstantiation entirely. The bread and wine were symbols, not miracles. The altar became a table. The priest, a minister. The sacrifice, a memory. It was the final break, and not everyone followed. The court had changed, too. King Edward VI, pale and sickly but devout, clung to Cranmer's guidance like a drowning boy. They prayed together, read scripture together. But Edward was dying. At night, Cranmer would sit by the fire, his hands clasped so tightly that his knuckles ached. He had bet everything: soul, reputation, eternity on this fragile boy king. If Edward died, everything they built would burn. And Edward died. Cranmer wasn't at the deathbed, but he felt it, like a cord snapping in the dark. The morning after the king's death, London trembled. Bells rang, but with confusion. Not mourning. The succession had been rewritten. Mary, the Catholic daughter of Catherine of Aragon, was bypassed. Instead, Lady Jane Grey was proclaimed queen. She was 16, thin, bookish, Protestant, and Cranmer had backed it. He had signed his name to the act, had knelt beside the council, had whispered the prayer that would crown her. But the people did not follow. The tide turned fast. In just 9 days, Jane was unseated. Mary took the throne, and with her came the smoke. Cranmer stood in his study, staring at the letter. A summons. He read it again, then again. His hand shook, but not from fear, from rage. He had watched Mary grow up, had watched her mother, Catherine, pray in silence as Henry tore the kingdom in half. Cranmer had dissolved their marriage, had baptized Anne Boleyn's child, had written the liturgies that made Mary an exile in her own country. Now, she was queen, and he was prey. Still, he went. He walked into Lambeth Palace one last time, his feet echoing on stone floors now shadowed with uncertainty. He did not say goodbye to his servants. He did not pack. He left behind everything but his cassock and his silence. In the Tower of London, they took his rings, his cross, his books. His cell was small, wet. Rats moved along the walls at night. The food came cold and late. The guards did not speak. He prayed aloud sometimes, but mostly he stared at the blank wall across from his bed, tracing invisible verses with his fingers. Weeks passed, then months, and when they moved him to Oxford, he thought for a moment foolishly that maybe they had forgotten, that he might be released. But Oxford was no reprieve. It was a stage, and he was the final act. The first trial was not a trial, it was a theater of humiliation. The judges spoke in Latin. The crowd watched like wolves, and Cranmer, stripped of his robes, was forced to argue for his soul in chains. His voice cracked, his answers faltered. They asked if the Pope was Christ's vicar. He said no. They asked if the Mass was a sacrifice. He said no. They asked if he believed in the Church of Rome. He said, simply, I cannot. They condemned him, but did not burn him. Not yet, because they wanted more than justice. They wanted surrender. So they left him alone. Alone with the guilt. Alone with the silence. Alone with the memories of Ridley and Latimer, tied to the stake, screaming in fire. He had watched them burn, and now he dreamed in smoke. The days in Oxford were cold and damp, but the nights, those were the worst. They crept in like a second skin, pressing against his chest, seeping into his bones. Cranmer slept little. When he did, he dreamed of fire, not the fire to come, but the fire that had already taken his friends. He saw Ridley bound, rigid, eyes wide with horror as the flames licked up his robes. He saw Latimer, gasping smoke, crying out through the agony, Be of good cheer, Master Ridley. We shall this day light such a candle, by God's grace, in England, as I trust shall never be put out. But in his dreams, the candle always went out. He was allowed no books, no visitors, only interrogators. They came dressed like priests, but they acted like butchers cutting knotted flesh. But at thought, they asked the same questions, over and over, in voices that sounded kind. Doesn't Christ desire obedience? Wouldn't a true believer return to the Holy Church? Would you really let your pride condemn your soul? Cranmer answered at first, quietly, carefully, but over time, his voice grew dull. The guards watched him change. His hands, once sure and scholarly, now trembled constantly. His skin grew pale, thin, almost translucent, as if the man himself was fading. He flinched at loud noises, stared too long at nothing. Once when a rat scurried across the floor in the night, he curled up in the corner like a child. There were no screams in this prison, no chains, no whip, just silence, and the weight of his own thoughts pressing down on him like a stone altar. And then, something shifted. One morning, a fire was lit in the hearth outside his chamber. He could smell it. Not smoke, not ash, charred flesh. They didn't tell him what had happened. They didn't need to. He knew. Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Ridley, his brothers in belief, had been executed, publicly, together. He had heard the rumors, long before Oxford, that they would come for them all, but he had hoped foolishly that they might spare the oldest. Now that hope turned to dust. Cranmer sat still for hours that day, unmoving, eyes glassy, lips slightly parted. When a guard brought food, he didn't eat. When the priest returned with another round of questions, he didn't speak. The silence became an answer. They had broken something inside him, but it wasn't his faith. Not yet. What truly broke him came weeks later. They moved him, not to a cell but to a house. Clean bed, warm bread, books, freedom of a certain kind. They told him he was no longer a prisoner. They said he was being prepared for peace. At first, he didn't believe them. He thought it was a trick. But the warmth wore down his suspicion. And the voices, those calm, coaxing voices, never stopped. They spoke of mercy, of forgiveness, of how even Peter denied Christ 3 times. 3 times, they repeated, and Christ still loved him. They said the church would welcome him back, that his soul mattered more than his pride, that God himself was waiting. Cranmer sat by the window for hours each day, staring at the spire of St. Mary's Church in the distance. He watched the crows gather there, dozens, silent, patient. And then he began to write. The first recantation was mild, a nod toward Rome, a softening of language. He claimed to submit to the Pope not in heart, but in principle. It was not enough. So he wrote another, stronger, more humiliating. He renounced the Reformation, denied the Book of Common Prayer. He called it false, misleading, heretical. Still not enough. So he wrote again. This time, he named himself. He called himself a heretic, a misleader, a liar. He spat on the names of Ridley, Latimer, even Edward VI. He begged for the Pope's mercy, begged to be re-accepted into the fold. He signed it Thomas Cranmer, unworthy servant of God. The church had what it wanted, or so it believed. But even then, even in that hour of surrender, something inside Cranmer remained taut, coiled. They gave him a final instruction. Read your recantation, publicly, from the pulpit of St. Mary's. He agreed. He nodded, smiled faintly, folded his hands. But no one, not the bishops, not the Queen, not even Cranmer himself could foresee what would happen next. Because something had shifted in that silence. Something had awakened in the hollow space where his pride used to be. It wasn't rage or defiance. It was something colder, clearer. The knowledge that his words had power, and that this time they would burn. The morning of March 21st, 1556, broke gray over Oxford. Low clouds crawled across the sky, sagging with moisture, but giving no rain. The wind whispered through narrow alleys, like a voice too hoarse to be heard. Inside Christ Church College, the guards moved like shadows, quiet, precise. They brought Cranmer out before dawn. He hadn't slept. He hadn't touched his food. His breath clouded in the air. His fingers, thin and cold, trembled slightly, not with fear, but with something harder to name. They dressed him in simple robes, not the scarlet of a cardinal, nor the black of mourning, but white like a child being led to baptism. His face was hollow now. The skin had pulled inward around his eyes. But there was something else there, too. A stillness. Not peace, not defiance, a kind of absence like the tide withdrawing before a storm. The church was already full. St. Mary the Virgin, the heart of Oxford. The pulpit had been polished, the pews packed. Bishops lined the front rows, students pressed against columns. Even a few noblewomen had come, their veils trembling. The air inside was heavy. Still, candles burned low. Incense coiled in thin silver streams through the cold air. This was meant to be a spectacle, a final submission, a lesson for those who still dared whisper the Protestant creed behind closed doors. The crowd had come to watch a great man fall all the way down. They expected tears, shame. They expected the final nail in a coffin he had built with his own heresies. Cranmer was led to the pulpit. He climbed slowly one step, then another, his hand trailing along the wooden rail. When he reached the top, he did not look at the crowd. He looked at the crucifix above the altar, just for a second. Then he unfolded the parchment. The bishop sat forward. The scribe dipped his quill, and Thomas Cranmer began to speak. The first words were as expected, a prayer, a plea for mercy. "I have sinned," he said, "against heaven, against my brothers, and against Holy Church." He paused. "I have written recantations, 6 of them." Another pause. He lowered the parchment. "I come now to declare that all of them were false." The words dropped into the silence like a hammer on glass. Murmurs rose, a rustle of robes. A bishop half rose from his seat. But Cranmer didn't flinch. "What I have written with this hand," he said, lifting it, "I will burn with this hand." His voice was steady, stronger now. "This unworthy right hand, which signed against the truth, shall be punished first." Someone gasped. A young student near the back dropped his prayer book. "I believe," Cranmer said, "in the gospel as I once preached it. I deny the Pope. I deny the Mass. And I go to my death with my faith in Christ alone." The guards were already moving. The bishop was shouting. The crowd surged in panic and disbelief. But Cranmer did not move. He folded the parchment, set it on the pulpit, and stepped down. Calm as a man going home. The doors of the church blew open with the wind. They took him through the streets. The path from St. Mary's to Broad Street was short, but it felt eternal, stone by stone. He walked between rows of silent townspeople. Some spat, some wept, most just stared. The pyre had already been built, thick logs, dry kindling, iron chain. He saw it from afar and did not look away. They tied him to the stake. Not tightly, he offered no resistance. The wind had picked up, but there was no rain, only ash from the previous burnings, still clinging to the stones. The executioner brought the torch. The bishop read a final prayer. Cranmer said nothing, until the flames touched him. Then he lifted his right hand, up and out above the fire. He held it there, steady, while the skin blackened, the flesh shriveled, the fingers curled like leaves in autumn. He did not scream. He whispered, "This hand hath offended, this unworthy hand," again and again. Even as the fire reached his face, even as his robes caught, and the crowd cried out, he held his hand in the flames like a penance. And then, finally, he collapsed. They say the smell of burning cloth and flesh hung over Oxford for days, that students woke screaming at night, swearing they saw his eyes in the smoke. But the truth is simpler. He was gone, and something else had begun. They had planned it as a warning, an ending, a public defeat. But Thomas Cranmer did not die the way they had written. He died rewriting them. The crowd at Broad Street did not cheer. No bells rang, no triumph, only silence, heavy, suffocating, as if Oxford itself held its breath. And in that silence, the whispers began. What had he said? Did he really defy the Pope in front of the bishops? Was it true he burned his own hand? The authorities denied it. Clerks destroyed copies of his speech. But it was too late. His final words had slipped their grasp, and now they were being repeated, hushed, trembling in taverns, classrooms, and behind locked doors. Not as treason, as truth, a truth that refused to die. For the Protestant faithful, it was resurrection. They had mourned him as a coward, a traitor to the cause. But now, they clung to his last gesture like a gospel. This hand hath offended. They whispered it, prayed it, raised their own right hands in secret, trembling, mimicking the gesture of a man who had collapsed and then stood up inside the fire. Even among Catholics, his death unsettled. He had returned, not from prison, but from despair, from spiritual ruin. What kind of man begs for mercy 6 times, only to choose martyrdom in the end? His refusal had not just defied their power, it had exposed it. He had played their game, and then overturned the board. In London, Queen Mary received the account in silence. She read it, folded the parchment, folded it again, and then threw it into the fire. Not in anger, but as if to undo what could no longer be undone. The executions continued. More pyres burned. But something had changed. Cranmer's death had bent the air. It lingered, like smoke that would not clear. 2 years later, Mary died, her sister. Elizabeth ascended. She did not speak of Cranmer, not at first, but soon. His Book of Common Prayer returned, not edited, not sanitized, restored. His words once again filled cathedrals. His liturgy crowned Elizabeth. His voice erased in fire became the voice of a nation. No statue was ever raised for Cranmer, but his sentences sharp. Spare. English entered the bloodstream of worship, not because he died, but because of how he died. Not in glory, but in ruin, in smoke, in that final act of surrender and defiance. He proved what power could never accept, that even the most shattered soul might still choose truth. And that sometimes, the most lasting light comes from a man already burning. Years passed, but the flames of Broad Street never cooled. Even as the soot faded from Oxford's walls, even as new students walked beneath the spire of St. Mary's with books under their arms and ink on their fingers, the ghost of that morning lingered, not as fear, but as something harder to name. The memory of Thomas Cranmer did not die in fire. It multiplied, first in whispers, then in pulpits, then in Parliament. By the time Queen Elizabeth sat on England's throne, the ground had shifted, not just politically but spiritually. No more Latin in the Mass, no more papal supremacy, no more priests hidden in dark confessionals, wielding salvation like a blade. Instead, there was language. Cranmer's language. The Book of Common Prayer returned in 1559. It was not just reprinted, it was restored. With the same words, the same cadence, the same theological cuts that had once sparked rebellion. Its pages did not just prescribe prayer, they shaped it. And in doing so, they shaped the soul of a nation. At funerals, the mourners heard Cranmer's voice in the midst of life. We are in death. At baptisms, it was his rhythm that blessed the water. At the coronation of Elizabeth herself, his liturgy once condemned, now sacred echoed beneath the vaulted ceiling. The man they burned was now England's voice. But there was something else. Something quieter. Not written in books, not declared by crown or bishop. It lived in the way people remembered him. Not as saint, not even as hero, but as something closer. A man who had broken publicly, repeatedly. A man who had denied the very truth he once preached. And still he returned to it. Not in private, not in secret, but in the most terrifying place imaginable. Inside the fire. To those who had watched his fall, his redemption was unbearable. Because it said something no system of power wanted to admit. That weakness does not erase belief. That failure is not the end of the story. That even a shattered man, stripped of dignity, reduced to ash, can still be right. And that truth, once spoken, burns longer than flesh. Across the English countryside, the changes spread. Old churches reopened with plain walls and English prayers. The altars were stripped, the Latin buried, and in every town, from York to Canterbury, from Salisbury to Norwich. People spoke aloud words that once marked them for death. Cranmer had died a condemned heretic, but now his words were on the lips of millions. Still, not everyone forgot the fire. In Rome, his name remained cursed. Among Catholics, his prayer book was seen as theft, as blasphemy with a velvet tongue. And in England itself, even under Elizabeth, there were many who still whispered doubts about his loyalty, about his soul, about what kind of man recants 6 times and only finds his courage in the moment of death. But the truth is not simple, and neither was he. Cranmer was not born a martyr. He became one the hard way, through hesitation, through terror, through the long, rotting silence of a prison cell where even the rats kept their distance. And maybe that's why his final act mattered. Because it wasn't perfect. It wasn't pure. It was earned. Hard, bloody, human. There is no grave for Thomas Cranmer. Only a small cross carved in the stone of Broad Street. Most pass by without looking, without knowing. But some stop. They run their hand over the warm granite in summer, or the frozen slab in winter, and they listen to the wind between the colleges, to the echoes of a voice that once stammered in shame and then rose in flame. And in that silence, they hear a question. Not from the church, not from history, but from themselves. What would you say? If the last thing you ever spoke was the only thing the world remembered, the stones of Broad Street hold no inscription, no statue, no shrine, just a narrow brass cross, set into the pavement, walked over by strangers, washed by rain, ignored by time. But if you stand there long enough, just long enough to hear the wind shift between the rooftops of Oxford, you might feel it. The echo, the weight, the flicker of a man who died not to be remembered, but to be understood. He wasn't fearless. He wasn't unbroken. He had betrayed what he believed. He had begged, lied, yielded. And then when it no longer mattered, when there was nothing left to gain, he stood. He did not reclaim his honor. He burned it. Some deaths silence history. His did not. His became a question about the line between courage and collapse, about what a soul costs after it has been sold, about whether redemption is still redemption if it comes too late. No music played when Thomas Cranmer died. No banners waved. Only a voice, cracked by ash, whispering into the fire. This hand hath offended. And then silence. Not peace, not absolution. Just silence. The kind that waits, and watches, and remembers.